Hello, you're listening to 100th special episode of Web-standarты podcast. I'm your host Vadim Makeev from HTML Academy. Today I'm in Moscow at Frontend Conf with our special guest Andy Bell. Tell us a bit about yourself.
It is the first time in Russia. I've never been here before, and it's really good. I really like it here. And obviously the first time at this conference, which again, has just been a really good experience being here. And best way to describe myself is I'm a freelance web designer and I specialize in CSS, HTML, progressive enhancement, and mainly work with large-scale design system work.
I tried freelance many years ago when I was just starting, and it still terrifies me. Like you have to self-manage everything. You have to be responsible for many things. How do you manage it? Is it an easy thing to do? Do you enjoy being in freelance?
Yeah, I'm happiest when I'm my own boss. So that alone gives me a lot of will to make it work. But I'm hyper-organized. Everything is ridiculously organized to the nth degree. So I use an app called Notion, which is like a really flexible thing. And in there, I literally have everything, all my client communications run through it, design feedback, project management, everything runs through the same hub. So I'm always one step ahead in terms of being organized. I think that's the key for success in freelance is learning how you work yourself, what you're good at, and how long it takes you to do things, how you organize yourself. And if you get all that right, and obviously get good at landing work, you do pretty well with it. Yeah.
All right. Maybe I should try.
It should try. Yeah. It's definitely an acquired taste. I know some people who are ridiculously good at what they do, but they really struggle with freelance. So it is. It's a lot more of a diplomacy job rather than a coding and designing job. You do a lot of communication stuff when you freelance. And I think that's one of the things you've got to get good at is talking to clients and doing the jobs that you don't do when you work in an agency or a product team. You know, you've got to do the account management and all that stuff yourself. Yeah.
Yesterday, Pavel, who's sitting right next to us in the room, told me the story how you get here. So you posted a tweet like you're open for talks in this season, and I retweeted it.
Oh wow!
And he saw it. So that's how it happened.
Yeah, it was great. So he emailed me while I was on holiday in Greece, and I looked in my inbox and I saw him, and he was like, "Oh, do you want to speak in Moscow at Front End Conf?" And admittedly, I'd never heard of Front End Conf, but I didn't even look it up. I just responded straight back with, "Yep, let's do it," because I really wanted to go to Moscow and explore the city. So I was just
I've been reading Hayden Pickering for many years. That's how I saw your Twitter as well, and then I started reading you, and then I retweeted you, and that's how you. So
and I appreciate that because that's why I'm here.
That's what happened. That was
amazing.
I thought it was just you applied or they invited you or something like this. But that's
amazing.
That's interesting.
Well, that's a good story. Because I've written this talk. Quite recently, I did it the first time at a really good event in the UK called State of the Browser. So I wrote it for that conference specifically. And then when you write a talk for the first time, you never know how it's going to go down with everyone. So I was really unsure about it, but it seemed to go down really well there. So I was like, you know what, I'll do it some other places. So that's why I said, look, if you want a speaker, then give me a shout. And here I am today.
One reason I was really happy to see you on this conference. That's one reason is that I'm following you, so it was really good to see you in person. And the other, I rarely meet people who so passionately in love with CSS. You know, even when you're like HTML coder, if you're not a programmer, you always have doubts. People around me, at least, they always have doubts, and sometimes they even hate things they do. But every once in a while, I meet people who are in love with CSS. And why is it so for you?
Yeah, I think I'm a designer first. So I was a designer first, and I used to hand my designs over to developers, and then they handed me their work back, and I used to look at it and be like, have you even looked at the design? You know, so they design it. And then I was like, you know what? I'm just going to learn CSS, and I'm going to learn how to do this myself. And I just found the language so flexible and so, I hate the word scale, but it's scalable. It builds up nicely. It's forgiving, but it is complicated because there's a lot of nuance and a lot of there's obviously the coding skill to learn, but it's understanding how that language works in the browser that's probably one of the biggest skills in CSS. And I think that is probably why it gets a bad rap, because misunderstanding a lot of the time, an expectation for it to behave in a way that it doesn't behave. And I think it confuses people and they blame it on issues. And this is what that talk sort of addresses. It's like, the problem isn't the language, it's maybe you need to talk to each other more and approach it in a different way, in a sort of simplified way. And hopefully it's sort of resonating with people the way I'm doing things.
Yeah. I believe the audience was listening very quietly, and it
was a really good audience. Yeah, really good.
So you said you're a designer first, meaning that you learned some design tricks first, and then learned a few other browser tricks as well. Do you design in browser?
Yes, I do now. I didn't, but I find now. So I'll still do look and feel stuff in Sketch, Illustrator, and
basically,
stuff like that.
You just start with idea.
Yeah,
you play with colors and shapes.
Yeah, exactly. And I wireframe. So when I do wireframe, and I do it by hand in a notebook with a pen. So because I think
old-fashioned.
Yeah, the important thing with a wireframe is to get the ideas out of your head. And if you try and do high fidelity wireframes, it confuses the client, because like, is this the design?
It takes a lot of time.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time. So if I just send them a sketch in a notebook, they know straight away that this is not the design that I'm presenting to them. This is me saying, look, I think we should lay it out like this. I think we should put this content here and do this, that, and the other. And it tends to work really well. But then when I've worked out the design system elements, the tokens, and all that stuff, then I move into the browser and actually design it with HTML and CSS, because I think it's the best way to work out how the design's working in terms of semantics and stuff like that. And also, when you send that to the client, they can see the real design in the browser, in the context. So they can open it on the phone and they'll be like, oh, cool, yeah, it looks great.
And they can also click through.
Yes, exactly. And they can resize it and they can play around with it and they can see it. And then when, so what I do when, and it's a tip for people maybe thinking about going freelance, is when I hand over design work to clients, I don't just send them a link, and I especially don't ring them. What I do is I record a screencast of the design and me talking about the design to them.
So like a small presentation.
Yeah, and as if you were in a meeting with them. But the key thing is because you do it as a screencast, it gives them time to think and think about feedback. When you're talking to someone in person or when you're talking to someone on the phone, a lot of the time they feel like they have to say something.
Oh yeah, because it feels weird when one person is talking and the other just listening.
Exactly.
It feels like the second one has nothing to say.
Exactly, and you get loads of dangerous feedback in that situation where they probably don't mean what they say, but they feel like they have to say something, and you can have like one piece of feedback that can snowball into something that doesn't work.
Can you play with fonts, and can you move this thing and make it bigger?
When they're trying to say something else, but if you give them time to think, so whenever I do a screencast, I always end it the same of, don't rush your feedback back to me. Sit about and think about it. I can progress with other things. Just, when you're ready.
Yeah, sleep on it.
And stuff, And then what I do is I make them then put that feedback in Notion, like I described earlier. So it's all a circle of organization for me. So, that's a tip there. If you're thinking about doing like freelance design, or even like if you're in an agency or something, like it's a really good way of explaining why you've made decisions, but not expecting them to immediately feedback on it. So then everyone gets time to just chill out and think about it properly.
I tried once to move from, Sketch is also my tool of choice, but I started playing around with Figma recently.
Oh yeah.
I'm mostly, I think I would call myself designer first as well, because I used to learn design and photography and things like that, but then moved from journalism, these things, to technology. So I tried once to design in browser, but I go into details of implementation very, very quickly. It takes a lot of time, just like designing everything in Sketch, for example, and then put it into browser. It's also slow. So it should be somewhere in the middle, but I couldn't find a spot.
So I think some advice for that is, the code that I write when I do design is garbage. It's rubbish. It's awful code, and because I don't let myself think about the actual code. The markup is semantics. So I think it's quite easy to think of the semantics without getting too preoccupied. But in terms of CSS, like the code that I write for design, you can't ship it. It's like literally held together with sticky tape and dreams.
But it hurts when you're when you're writing bad code.
It's definitely a mind shift is getting into it. But I sort of forgive myself. So I sort of think to myself, right, I'm just gonna thrash this out, concentrate on the design, and then when the client's happy with it, what you've got is a real context. It's almost still like a sketch document. You still got to build it.
Yeah,
you've done a lot of the sort of CSS thinking, at least inadvertently, so you can pull out the sort of common elements and you can create components out of that then.
But have you tried to export things from Sketch to HTML, for example?
Yeah, and that landscape is getting much better now,
because you wouldn't have to write trash code. It would generate trash code for you.
That sounds good.
Automated tools are good at it.
Yeah. There's this, I can't remember what it was called. It was called Makeev or something years ago.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Yeah, that one was cool.
I supported this thing on Indiegogo or what was the...
That's a blast from the past, yeah.
Yeah, and then they shipped it and they just abandoned it.
I remember thinking at the time, like, this to me feels like the future of design tools, something that that generates code. But then the danger is that then people ship that, and it was nasty code that it generated. I think one thing that's cool that seems to be getting better and better over the years is Webflow. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I've seen that.
That seems to be getting much better. And that empowers people to build things that don't code then as well. So
I like this joke. There is a way to design in browser. You just open Figma and you design in browser.
I've never tried Figma.
It's so similar to Sketch that you just forgetting the difference like in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But it's worse. It's worse in many ways. But
because the thing with Sketch that I've never liked is that it's Mac only. So you're limiting access to it.
I believe they're working on browser version of Sketch.
Oh wow,
yes.
That'd be cool.
I think they got some investment, so they're working on a browser. So they're going to expand to Windows, Linux, or any platform with browser.
That's really good to hear.
Even iPad, I believe.
Yeah, that'd be the dream. I think that's one thing that I've sort of highlighted Figma as a thing to investigate, because I'd love to be able to just do design work on an iPad. I think that'd be amazing because you've got pen and you can actually it's a much more realistic way of doing things. So that's the dream. See how it goes. Yeah.
So going back to technology, together with Hayden, you both started this Every Layout project. So what was the idea behind this project?
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do is start how we started with it. So we were both singing off the same hymn sheet as each other independently. We were both writing about CSS in a very similar way to each other, where we were, instead of like pixel pushing and making really rigid CSS, we were both saying like in different ways, try and make things more flexible, try and hint the browser rather than micromanage it. And we just got talking, and Hayden, he'd already sort of started the early work on it. And he was like, "Do you want to get involved in this project that I'm putting together?" And I was like, "Yep, sounds right up my street." And so we sort of knuckled down, created these layouts. So the fix, when you go on the site, you can see the fix very particular problems. And then the whole idea is that the solution to the problem that we've created is really flexible, really scalable, it's progressively enhanced, and it should be able to give you a really sort of solid foundation for layout work. And the bonus is that we teach you loads of sort of core CSS skills as well, with there's various rudiments that we go through and all that stuff, which sort of explains how things work and why things work in CSS. And,
but it's not a library. It's just it's more of a book or more of a like tutorial.
Yeah, it's sort of like a weird hybrid of a book and a course. So when you buy it, you get an EPUB, a book, and a PDF, and then you get access to the premium version of the site. So it's got all like interactive demos of the components and the layouts, and so it helps you learn how they work. We make sure that we're not just giving you the code, we're explaining why we've written it and then how it works, and then hopefully when you implement it yourself, because we don't expect people to just lift and drop it. We expect them to say, "Oh, cool, I understand that now, so now I'm going to implement something similar in my project." And so far it seems to be going down really, really well. So it's making us both very happy.
Yeah, that's cool. I got it myself.
Yeah,
like the first hours or when you announced it.
Oh, thank
because
you. Yeah.
I really like the idea behind it, and I really like to see people, just like I said before, in love with CSS, making some alternative assumptions about CSS and how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
And it's super valuable to have different opinions. At least it's not that 100% agree with you.
No.
Probably I have some things to argue with you on, but yeah, I really like the idea that you're trying to make it simple and accessible for beginners even.
Yeah. And the thing is, what we're trying to do is to create the opposite as to what the common discourse is about CSS. So it often gets thrown away as being antiquated and old, whereas what we're trying to do is instead say it's not, if you look at it in a different way. So instead of, and it's what I mentioned in the talk as well, it's like it's a perception thing. If you create an environment that changes the perception of the code that's in front of your face, then often it gets looked on in a much better light. And then if you change the way that you're writing it, instead of saying expecting it to do this rigidly, you're saying, look, if you can do this, lay it out like this, but if not, it's cool, just stack it. And and it just seems to be a much less stressful way of writing CSS, I found.
That's true. Back to your talk. I have a number of questions that I should have asked during a Q&A session, but I'll just ask right away because I have a podcast.
Yeah, you can do what you want.
Yeah, that's cool. You mentioned that you're still using Sass.
Yep.
And I got rid of it a couple of years ago because I thought I'll use the platform. It's enough for me. Probably some media queries mix-ins, and probably some variables inside of media queries. Those things I miss, but otherwise I'm totally happy with what I got with just plain CSS and some post-processing, like stitching it together, adding prefixes and things like that. So that's my workflow. And you mentioned that Sass is or SCSS is syntax is super compatible with CSS because every CSS file is valid and compatible as CSS file. That's the idea behind the language. And you mentioned that like custom properties, they just appeared and they just worked. But I remember a situation when Sass was and especially SCSS was incompatible for half a year maybe or even more with named grid lines, for example, square brackets.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it reminds me of a situation with React, because they have their own synthetic events.
Yeah.
And if so, they have to implement event. Even if it's supported in browser, they have to proxy it and implement on their side. And if they decide not to implement, or they're just stuck on implementing it, it wouldn't work. The same with Sass. Like I was really pissed off about it. Like they allowed us to use named grid lines after half a year.
Yeah.
I think that was the point when I decided to go pure CSS.
That's understandable as well. I think this important thing about just tools in general.
It's not that I was using constantly named grid lines like a year and a half ago or 2 years ago.
You just wanted to use them in general.
I was just really disappointed by the idea that they need to allow me to write CSS that would work in browser. So I really like the idea that they're super compatible, but then they just failed.
That's fair. That's a very fair comment. And I think that sort of goes down with the attitude that tools are always limited in some way. I like what you say about using the platform because you can, and this is what I say in the talk as well, you can absolutely write really big CSS projects with vanilla CSS. That's the whole point where I'm saying, look, the support's really high for everything. We've got these tools now, like custom properties, that help us tokenize CSS. So it's very possible. The thing with Sass for me is it's more of a personal preference more than anything else, because I like the way that. So when I mentioned the design token stuff about in the methodology, I use Sass to generate those tokens classes from an external source. So it gives me sort of contextual stuff that's useful still that I can't quite get with CSS. I could probably generate those classes elsewhere, but I like to generate all the CSS stuff together. So it's just a preference thing more than anything. But I certainly don't discount normal CSS for sure. You could definitely do a hell of a lot with CSS.
When I was just starting back in 2003, I'm not a veteran as Eric Meyer, but
no one is.
I've been around. I've been around for a while, and I remember writing my projects like this: index.html, style.css, like script.js, some folder with images, and that's it. They weren't perfect. They weren't probably performant enough because they weren't like compressed and optimized. My files and my projects, but they were just working right away. Like you just copy it on a flash drive, or you just send it to somewhere in an archive, and they could just double click the file and it would open. That's thing I really liked about those times, and I'm trying to recreate the same process as much as possible these days as well. So instead of I used to I have this presentation engine called Shower. Leone used yesterday. I was really surprised.
That was really good that you created it. Leone was talking about it, and you both just sat next to each other, and the penny dropped. It was like, oh, that's my framework.
That's cool. So I started it based on Sass because I was using Sass in those days. But then it got so complicated. I had to generate two separate CSS files, 4:3 and 16:9 resolutions, because I had to pass some variables to resize things and like that. So then I just rewrote everything using pure CSS. And instead of two files, I got one file. I started to use calc and custom properties a lot, and I can launch it with just a browser. So that's my current workflow. You were talking about simplicity in your talk. Do you think it aligns with this principle and it's achievable these days, or I'm just a dreamer?
I think you literally just given the perfect case study for what I'm talking about in the talk. You saw the problem that you had, and then you slowed down, thought about it, and you simplified it, and then now you've got a better outcome for it.
Even better. So I never thought that it's possible to achieve in a single file. Using some calculations, like crazy ones, but still.
Calc is incredible. It's an incredibly useful CSS tool. It's got ridiculously high support as well. So I think that's a really good case study of exactly what I'm talking about with CSS.
Do you have workflows similar to this, or do you see people around you doing this?
So I try and reduce as much of that as I possibly can. I'm really hyper aware of how much code gets shipped to the browser, mainly because I focus a lot on low-powered devices and slow
like the
connections.
Moto G4 you mentioned.
Exactly. And because I think something about our industry is we forget that a lot of people that actually use the web are not using high-powered Macs. They're not using fast connections, and they're not using even remotely high-powered devices. So it's important to optimize for the majority rather than the minority. And so what I have at home is a £20 Android phone that I got off Amazon, or was it 30? It's something like that. It's dirt cheap. It's really slow, but I test everything through it. And if it's usable on that phone, it's good to go. That's my rule of thumb. And what I'm doing in the future is I'm doing a course, writing 2 new courses, and one of them I'm teaching people how to build a landing page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy 2 really popular Android phones. Alex Russell from Google recommended me 2 really good devices.
Android 2, I believe.
Yeah, that was it.
No, not Android. Nokia 2.
That's it, Nokia 2.
Nokia 2.
And then there was another one as well. I can't remember what the model was. I've got them in Notion, of course. And so I'm going to get them. And then basically during the course and while we're learning how to do stuff, we're going to be constantly referring back to these devices to make sure that what we're building is working in them, and that's going to be the whole sort of basis of it. It's like we're going to build a really flash landing page, but it's also going to work on a really low-powered device on a slow connection as well.
That's an interesting challenge.
Yeah,
and do you think it's something easy to achieve, or
it will be? I think it'll be challenges, but I think what I'm trying to sort of demonstrate is that it's it's possible and feasible, and it's what we should be doing as an industry. The web is, by design, the web is supposed to be open and accessible to everyone. And this is, why I'm really into accessibility as well. And I think we lose that a little bit sometimes, and we prioritize developer experience over user experience. And I think this is me trying to sort of combat that and say, look, it's possible to enjoy building a project, and at the end of it is to have something that works for everyone. The real principles of the web. So yeah, exciting stuff.
Another question I have. You mentioned this lobotomized OL selector invented by Hayden, I believe.
I think it was. That's where I got it from.
Well, at least named by Hayden.
Yeah.
And I really like the name. And this albatross one is as
typically Hayden name.
Yes,
for
absolutely. But it makes me cringe, or when I look at it, something's wrong about it. It's super flexible, but it's not flexible enough for me. Like if I have something like a wrapper around, and it's probably gonna break at some point. So what I really like instead of those, like having margins between elements inside of some card element, for example, to make grid context and use gap property instead. So it works the same way. It's a property of a container, not child elements. So it makes things easier. And also in grid context, you don't have those collapsing margins.
Yeah.
No nonsense.
Yeah. No, it is a very valid way of doing things.
Yeah. So here's my question: do you think it's overkill to put grid or flex context everywhere just to solve those margins between elements?
Do you know what? I'll paraphrase, maybe slightly inaccurately. I'll paraphrase Rachel Andrew.
Huh?
If it works, it's right. That's the thing. So if it's working, then sweet. Happy days, yeah. And it's the same with so I used it, and Hayden does it. So it's one of our layouts, and every layout is called the stack, which is using that that setup. And I'll give you a link to it in the show notes. I wrote an article at the end of last year for 24 Words where I expand on the stuff that Hayden wrote for A List Apart and create this reusable token, utility / component that you can sort of sprinkle around your site to give you this sort of vertical rhythm and flow, and so it sort of combats some of the worries you've got there. And but grid's amazing, and if it's working, sweet, happy days, because the gap property is good, and we're going to get it in Flexbox too, which I think when we get it, I'll probably will just retire the bottomized style that's in stuff I do, because being able to just say it probably won't be row gap when it's in Flex, but being able to say I want that much space between siblings, that's incredible.
That's super cool.
On, say, on the container as well, which is where it should be. Yeah.
But even in cases where Flexbox is good enough, you don't have to pull out the grid layout. I tend to use grid because Flex does weird things to nested elements. Like they become weird in many ways. So because it's first of all they try to fit in one line, so you have to do this flex wrap thing. The second, they try to stay flexible as much as possible, so you have to fight that. In grid, you don't have this. So it's my default thing if I can afford the not supporting IE 11. I just use a grid context all the time, and sometimes I feel guilty about it. But then, after you mentioned this Rachel Andrews quote, I have a lot of respect for Rachel. Then I'll just
run with that instead. Yeah, that's what I do. Yeah, whatever Rachel says goes. I think I'll pull on that section of the talk where I mentioned progressive enhancement for that, where you generate a minimum viable experience. So because this is obviously an audio, basic audios, I've got a 3-column grid on 2 rows, and I use grid by default for it. And then what I do is I calculate what the minimum viable experience is, and that for me is just stacked boxes that have got control on the width of them, so they're nice and neat, and they've got space between them. And then where grid is supported, I just quickly undo a couple of CSS rules. So I think if you approach grid like that, then it doesn't, it's all good. You are supporting everyone, because support doesn't mean pixel perfection across every single feasible device. It just means a good user experience for everyone. So
progressive enhancement, all the things.
I love it. Progressive. I must. I need to do a click count of how many times I say it during talks, because I'm literally obsessed with the concept of progressive enhancement.
It's just that good.
Yeah, it's a really good way of building things, because you're sort of sailing in line with the principles of the web when you're doing progressive enhancement. That is how the web is supposed to work. It's supposed to sort of enhance itself, and how it's always worked. And it's why websites that were built 30 years ago or 20 years ago, whatever, they still work now in modern browsers. And then that's amazing. Yeah, and then I don't know if you saw it. A few folks like Jeremy Keith and Remy Sharp and Matt Bolton.
I saw a presentation at Frontiers.
Yeah, you were there, weren't you? Yeah. And they rebuilt the original browser. It was really good to follow along with that project. And then they were loading their websites, and especially with Jeremy, because how Jeremy builds everything is progressively enhanced. He's a real good person to follow about progressive enhancement, and his website was perfect in it, because he uses semantic HTML, which I know that's your bag, and it just works. There's just works.tm. It's great. It's a really good way of doing things, and the thing is, you just got to release some control that you think you've got.
I used to have a presentation with the word control on a slide, and it's what was crossed. Like, you don't have control. That's not how web works.
Just like I said
just let it go.
Yeah, I said in my presentation, then the browser is an incredibly hostile environment for your code. It always has been, and it always will be. Even now, that browser's incredible. You never know what you're going to get. Someone might have a rogue Chrome extension. Someone might have, I've had some awful Wi-Fi in my hotel here, so it'll just give up halfway through loading the page, so you only load half the page. So if your CSS doesn't load, it's fine, because your HTML is semantic. And then if your CSS loads and your JavaScript doesn't load, it's fine, because you've built it to be acceptable when JavaScript isn't loaded, and that's the key thing. So
if you're a good developer, if you care about your users,
that's it. It's a user experience focus rather than a developer experience
that's true.
Focus.
You mentioned during Q&A session that container queries are on your wish list
forever. Yeah.
And if they are gonna happen in browsers, in what form do you want them to be?
That's a good question.
This is podcast. I'm not asking you to describe it
how it
or write it down, but it's just a basic idea.
Yeah. So, for people that don't know what a container query or the concept of container query, it's instead of relying on viewport dimensions like we do with media queries, we rely on the container's dimensions instead. And that's really useful in the work I do with design systems, because you can build a component and say like a card, and you'll be setting the type size based on the viewport dimensions. But if that card appears in a sidebar, you don't have any context there. So you'll have massive type in there because you're in a massive screen. So the idea is that the sizing of elements can be controlled based on how big the card is at a given point. But the discussions have been going on for a long time. Browsers sort of scoffed them because there's going to be loads of calculation issues with CSS and the way it works, which is fine, understandable. The CSS isn't designed to break things. It's supposed to be an enhancement in itself. But recently there has been some talk on it again, and positive talk. People are doing stuff with resize observer and mutation observer stuff, which is really high performance, and I think that's helping spec writers to see it in a different way.
I've seen a number of polyfills based on resize observer and things like that, and mutation observer and some others.
Really high performance. Really good.
And some people even use it in production, and they're happy.
It's totally acceptable to do so, and we use some of that in every layout as well. It's a really good way, and I think it's changing the direction of the discourse about it. So I mean, it might happen, and if it does,
so you're optimistic.
Like I said in the Q&A, when container queries arrive, I think I might just retire because I don't think CSS can get any better at that point. For me personally, for the work that I do, it's just like when container queries arrive, it's like, oh, my problems are now all solved. So
speaking of perfect CSS, what do you think about CSS nesting, native one?
So just like I mentioned in the talk, it's good. And it's good that it's been talked about. I think it's a good way of writing CSS. I just worry, and it might be my naivety as to how browsers work, but when I see something that's going to require a lot of calculation, I do worry because of low-powered devices.
But I think the CSS, in terms of parsing CSS, in terms of parsing selectors, and working with a CSS file itself, just immediate in modern browsers. The slow part, when they have to, when you apply this to DOM. So if it's just a syntax sugar, basically, it should be super fast.
Yeah, and if it is, then that's great. It's just it's for me. It's just it concerns me because I've got like a pessimistic attitude towards stuff like that, because for me it feels like a focus on developer experience. But I'm also really willing to be proven wrong as well. I really want to be proven wrong because although, and I know I mentioned this in the talk, like people are very quick to sort of discard tools like Sass and stuff. But if native tools do come around, like custom properties, that help people tokenize and create like scalable CSS code bases, then I'm all ears, because what the positive impact will be is it will encourage developers who look at CSS as a bad technology choice and maybe make them think again about it, which is always a good thing. And maybe it'll remove some of the sort of JavaScript-based systems that we find ourselves with these days. So yeah, as always with CSS, new things can be great. And the way that the working group work these days, they put so much thought and consideration into things. I know that if and when they start really taking it seriously, that there's some very smart people who'll come up with good ways for it to work.
Yeah, you know? I'm also optimistic about it. You mentioned, or you presented in your talk, your methodology. I'm struggling to read the name.
C-Butte. Awful name.
Yeah,
terrible name.
Terrible.
I can't. I just, I'm desperately. I'm going to put some real thought into it because I need some synonyms for it.
Ask Hayden.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know. Actually, his naming is something to be desired sometimes. But
or Bruce Lawson.
Yeah,
he's also brilliant.
Yeah, I think Bruce is very good. I might shun Hayden, sorry Hayden, and go and talk to Uncle Bruce instead. But the whole idea of it is, I used to religiously use BEM, like really, and talk about BEM, write about BEM. Like I was really into
I'm
BEM.
a big BEM believer myself.
Yeah, and I still am as well. Like I do have a lot of time for it, but for me, when I was working with it on sort of complicated front ends, I found myself generating an absolute ton of modifiers for like complicated components. And
but that was my question. That's why I asked about why modifiers. Do you know the concept of a mix in BEM?
A mix?
Yeah.
No, I don't actually know.
No,
Yeah.
it's one of the core ideas in BEM, like in classic BEM that they invented in Yandex many years ago. So basically, when you're putting two blocks on the same node, on the same element, you're basically mixing two blocks on an element, meaning that the thing that you call token could be a block without modifiers, without elements, just a block of a single class.
Got it. No, I do know what you mean now.
So
yeah.
you can basically everything you showed us today, it could be named in BEM terms without adding extra utility, token, and things like that. And every time I look at like SMAX, IT CSS, yours methodology, I think, yeah, it's just a BEM with some extra layers that could be added for explaining additional things. But yeah, it's basically you're putting not a utility class, you're basically putting another block on the same node, and you're mixing two blocks together. That's
fair.
That's my idea.
So the thing with the utilities is that they're strictly single use, so they only do one thing ever. They'll only apply one property and one value, and that's it. And then the token thing is probably where it expands beyond, is when the design tokens and the stuff I work on way away from the CSS that I'm writing. So the sort of globalized design tokens that are, the whole idea of them is that they're able to power the web or power a native app or even power print and stuff like that. So they're stuff that live far away. And then what token CSS stuff is it generates a utility to implement that token. And I just found that I was writing better CSS by having that sort of separation rather than doing that. I mean, I suppose like the mixing, like I say, is a very viable way of doing things. Again, it's a personal preference more than anything.
Of course.
Just like I said in the talk, I was like, look, I've just outlined this methodology, and I really don't think it's the best way to write CSS, but it's a way that enables me to write consistent CSS, and that's the sort of key with any methodology is consistency. That should be the end goal. That every part of the CSS is predictable and maintainable as well.
But just the beauty of the original BEM idea is that it's super flexible. Like just 3 ideas, you can scale it to everything basically. And that's why it's still alive. That's why, like 10 years later, interfaces are different, contexts are different, but you can still apply this idea to BEM, almost everything.
And it was revolutionary as well. And the thing I like the most about BEM and stuff like it is that you can read markup and see the relationship of the CSS without even looking at the CSS itself. And I think that's so important to sort of allow people that don't write CSS to understand what the relationship,
what's going on.
Even aside from HTML semantics, to understand from the system level, this card has got a body and an image, and those are dependents of the card block, and that is you can just see that straight away. And then again with modifiers, you can see that that's a modified version of the original state, and it's a really nice way of writing CSS. And I've been a huge fan of it for years, especially the work that Harry Roberts did with it as well, and the writing he did about it. That really, and I used to use Inuit CSS. I used to use that, and that's what really got me into BEM. And I was like, from then on, and worked on really big design systems that are BEM powered and scale beautifully. So still a big fan.
Scale again.
I know. I absolutely hate the word. But it's like I say, it's like this sort of construct of communication that we're just cursed with, just like Jamstack.
I'll just put beeps.
Can you?
Instead of scale.
I'll just do me a version of it with the beeps instead. I have to listen to myself say it. Yeah.
You were listening to 100th special episode of Web Standard Podcast. Thank you, Eddie, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, hope to see you someday in St. Petersburg as well.
Definitely want to come to St. Petersburg. So yeah, so do I.
All right. Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Cheers.